Hello everybody and welcome to the third video in our series of videos on Northern Ireland from 1920 up until 1998. Today we will be looking at the beginning of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know why the NICRA was established. Second, you guys should know three major incidents at the beginning of the Troubles. And third, you guys should know how nationalists and the Northern Irish government responded to the escalating violence. So just to give a little background to the Troubles, Terence O'Neill became the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in 1963. He replaced Basil Brooke. Brooke had been Prime Minister for over 20 years. Northern Ireland had been had its own government since 1920. Terence O'Neill was only the fourth Prime Minister. Craig had reigned for 20 years. Andrews had replaced him, and then Brooke had replaced him and had ruled for over 20 years. So when O'Neill came in, he had three kind of main policies that he was trying to introduce. One of the big ones was he was trying to attract industry. Northern Ireland was a place that had really suffered with the industrial boom that went on in the 1950s. Remember, there was massive unemployment in the 1930s. World War II came along, industry picked back up, but as the decades progressed, by the 1960s, Northern Irish industry was massively in decline. The second thing he wanted to do is he wanted to end sectarianism by building bridges between the two traditions in our community, as he put it. And third, he wanted to improve relations with trade unions. The reason that O'Neill was pushing for these policies was that things were beginning to change in Northern Ireland. It was a country that had been defined by nationalists and unionists. But as conditions for both sides continued to get worse, Labour began to get more power. People were becoming more concerned about the ability to work. So O'Neill was trying to unify a base behind him on these things of attracting industry, of improving relations with trade unions, and of ending sectarianism to further his support. As we saw when we're looking at Sean Lemass, he also reached out to the Republic of Ireland. There was a meeting in Belfast in 1965, and in January of 1965, and then O'Neill went down and visited Dublin in February of 1965, and they wanted to encourage cooperation in things like tourism and agriculture. However, there was not uniform support for O'Neill's kind of progressive view of how Northern Ireland should move forward. Unionists were very unhappy with giving any kind of rights to Catholics. They felt that they would take over and that they would try to force the end of partition. So in 1966, a paramilitary organisation called the UVF was set up. This is not to be confused with the UVF of the Home Rule crisis. They took the same name, but they were not the same people. This was a paramilitary organisation aimed at kind of putting down the civil rights movement that was beginning to flower in Northern Ireland. And Reverend Ian Paisley here was one of the leaders of these extreme unionists. He really opposed the extending of civil rights to Catholics. So how were Catholic civil rights being denied? We looked at this before. Some of the stuff will be familiar to us, but just to go over it, only property owners could vote. It was this policy known as one man, one vote. This discriminated against Catholics because less Catholics actually had the ability to own their own home. So unless you owned your own home or were married to somebody who owned your own home, you could not vote. Another thing whereby their voting rights and their civil rights were being denied was the gerrymandering of constituencies, which we saw was the rigging of constituency borders to favour one side. Also, we saw in the liberal welfare state of 1947, there was an increase in local council houses being built, but Catholics were discriminated and didn't get as many. We also saw at the beginning, the foundation of the state, that the Catholics were being denied jobs in civil service. They were being kicked out of jobs in civil service and on local councils. And there was also a feeling that the police force was there to protect the Protestants. Remember, the B Specials was made up of primarily ex-Ulster Volunteer Force people who were unionist in slant. This led to the setting up of the NICRA, or the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. This was set up in 1968 by Catholics and nationalists, and they wanted to try to fix these prejudice policies. They identified these 5 things, as well as the removal of the Special Powers Act, as their main areas that they wanted addressed. They were led by people like Jerry Fitt, Austin Curry, John Hume, and Bernadette Devlin. On the 5th of October 1968, the NICRA had planned a march to go through Derry, peaceful march for promotion of the civil rights of Catholics. It had been banned because on the same day, the Apprentice Boys had a Protestant organisation, who we'll be looking at in a second, had wanted to plan a march on the same day. There was a fear this would lead to violence, so the march was banned. The NICRA went ahead with the march. They met. When they met, they were attacked by the RUC, the police force. It was an unprovoked attack. This was captured by cameras. The RTE cameras were there. They captured the police brutality. It was shown around the world and really showed the power of television and how it could show the discrimination that was going on in Catholics, that even just meeting up for a peaceful protest, they were being picked out by the RUC. This led to Terence O'Neill giving a very famous speech, his Ulster at a Crossroads speech. He tried to bring in reforms in housing and elections, with the gerrymandering especially, but he didn't bring in the one man, one vote demand the people had asked for. The NICRA were kind of happy to take this for now. It wasn't ideal, but they said, look, we won't do any marches for a while, but they wanted further concessions in the future. On the 1st of January 1969, however, university students from Derry planned a peaceful march. They were going to walk from Derry to Belfast to raise awareness for the discrimination against Catholics. When they entered Burntullet Bridge, which would be near Belfast, they were attacked by these hardline unionists. The police, the RUC, were there, but they did not interfere with the attacks on the protesters, or the marchers as it was. Many of the hardline unionists who actually attacked the protesters were off-duty RUC officers. As tensions began to rise, Terence O'Neill resigned in April 1969 after his party expressed a loss of confidence in him. He was replaced by Major James Chichester Clark, who was to become the 5th Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. He's not going to last very long either. There was another big event kicked off in Derry in August of 1969. The Apprentice Boys, who were an organisation who every year would march through the streets of Derry to celebrate a famous victory at the Siege of Derry, whereby the Catholic King James had tried to take the city of Derry. The gates were closed by 13 Apprentice Boys, and the city of Derry was saved from Catholics. So every year the Apprentice Boy March went and celebrated this victory. This was always seen as a very inflammatory thing to do to what was primarily a nationalist and Catholic city. Derry was primarily nationalist and Catholic. The march passed by the nationalist area known as the Bogside. Missiles began to be thrown at each other. The nationalists put up barricades to stop unionists and the RIC from entering into the Catholic area known as the Bogside. Rioting then began to spread in areas in Belfast, nationalist area in Belfast as well. Eventually, the British troops were called in as the people of the Bogside and the nationalists of Belfast didn't trust RUC to restore order. They welcomed the British troops. The nationalists actually welcomed the British troops in for protection for themselves. So how did the nationalists react to this growing violence? On a political level, the SDLP, or the Social Democrat and Labour Party, was founded by Jerry Fitt, had prominent members like John Hume in it, and they tried to unite all the nationalist and civil rights organisations into one party so that they would have a stronger voice in Parliament. There was also the paramilitary reaction, which would come from the IRA. The IRA had really kind of disappeared after its failed campaigns in the 50s. But they re-emerged in 1969. There was the official IRA, and they had wanted to move away from violence, but then there was also the establishment of this new IRA known as the Provisional IRA, or the Provos, and they wanted to continue using violent tactics. The Provisional IRA was initially set up as a defensive force, but in 1917 they started a violent bombing campaign and they killed civilians, soldiers, and RUC members. They also launched a campaign to turn nationalists against British soldiers who had been welcome as protection against the RUC. They encouraged young people to be throwing rocks and missiles at the British soldiers so that the British soldiers would retaliate and public opinion would turn against them as seen as defenders of the nationalists. Chichester Clark was replaced by Brian Faulkner as Prime Minister in 1971 due to ill health. And Faulkner, well, initially he seems to be a more progressive leader. He did reintroduce internment in August of 1971. This started with a thing known as Operation Demetrius, whereby they had planned for these nighttime raids to take out the leadership of the IRA. So on the 9th of August, these nighttime kind of dawn raids took place on suspected IRA members. 342 people were interned, but the operation turned out to be a complete disaster. The police and soldiers in Northern Ireland had very poor intelligence on the leadership of the IRA, which led to a lot of innocent people being arrested. None of the IRA leaders were actually arrested. This led then to rioting in the streets. Over the next couple of days, 20 civilians, 2 soldiers, and 2 IRA members were killed in the rioting afterwards. And this increased the support of the IRA. Again, the nationalists began to believe that they couldn't trust the soldiers now, as well as the RUC. Innocent people were being arrested, and people really feared for their lives. That brings us to the end of our presentation. So by now you guys should know why the NICRA was established, to deal with the discrimination against Catholics. You guys should know 3 major incidents at the beginning of the Troubles. So the March in Derry in October of 1968, the Burn Tullet Bridge incident in January of 1969, and the Battle of the Bogside. You should also know how nationalists responded to the escalating violence, and also how the government responded to this escalating violence. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.